Good morning, and welcome to the 2020 Big Sky Business Insight Summit. My name is Grant Kier. I am the president and CEO of the Missoula Economic Partnership, and we are delighted to welcome all of you across the state and across the region to the Big Sky Business Insight Summit. So just an overview of these 3 days and a little bit about the Big Sky Business Insight Summit. We believe at MEP, and we see this across the state of Montana, that our entrepreneurs are problem solvers, and they just have a strong spirit of overcoming challenge. We have found, especially we've seen this in our business community in Missoula, that willingness to identify challenges that so many of us face, turn those into business opportunities. And we certainly see that in our bioscience community, in our bioscience and healthcare sectors. What we tried to do with our Big Sky Business Insight Summit is create an opportunity for us to have a statewide dialogue to understand what are our challenges, what are we facing as a community in Montana that we want to overcome, and how can we create the conditions for the private sector and our big institutions to collaborate to overcome those problems. So with that, we've created a format over the next 3 days where we'll really try to understand and define what it is that is our strengths and weaknesses in our bioscience, biotech, tech, and healthcare industries. How have they helped us address and overcome the existing and past challenges we've faced with respect to COVID? Where do we stand today, and where are big opportunities for us going forward? How can we use and leverage the relationships we have across Montana and in these sectors to be able to address our acute needs? But more importantly, how do we collectively, as a state, create the conditions for our industries, for our researchers, for our institutions to be successful in addressing the problems of COVID as they face the world, but also to set the stage for Montana to become a more resilient community in the future. And not only is that resilience about being able to prepare for and respond to things like a pandemic, but also building a strong underlying economy that continues to promote education, workforce development, high-tech jobs, high-paying jobs, safe and sustainable jobs in industries that by our numbers really provide meaningful salaries that vastly exceed those of the average wages in Montana. So today, we're incredibly honored and excited to start the conversation with a look at our state of our economy and the state of this sector, and to see where it might be going and how we can think about and frame our conversations over the next 3 days with respect to sort of the state of these industries. And then we're delighted to have extraordinary fireside chat with Marshall Bloom, Director of Rocky Mountain Lab, and our Governor, Steve Bullock. And then we'll have a panel with some of the leading experts in some of our bigger institutions following that fireside chat to talk about the long history of bioscience, biotech, and some of our technology sector leaders who've really allowed us to create a strong foundation here and really built the platform upon which much of our success that we're seeing today and expect to see in the months and years ahead was built. So, without further ado, I want to just mention that I'm going to introduce Bryce Ward, who is with ABMJ Consulting. He is both an outstanding economist, but also a founder of a company, and I think very entrepreneurial in his view of the world. He has been instrumental in our work at MEP in understanding the state of our workforce, in understanding the directions we take as an organization, and maybe above all else, really helping us understand COVID, how we've had to respond to it. And he's just built a lot of strength and credibility in our community. And he's somebody we wanted to invite to share his thoughts and perspectives on the state of our bioscience sector, where it might be going, where it stands today. So Bryce, I want to bring you up here to present for the next 20 minutes or so. When Bryce is finished, I'll come back on and we'll talk a little bit about our next event. Thanks, Bryce.
Thanks, Grant. Pleasure to be here. All right. So as Grant mentioned, my job today is to kind of give you a sense of both where our biotech, bioscience industry is, how is it doing in Montana? And also, to the extent that we want it to be bigger. So, this is where we are. This is where we'd like to be. How do we maybe close that gap? And so, I've kind of titled my talk, how to grow a bioscience cluster. And back in the spring, when I took on my new job as elementary school home teacher, My first grader had it felt like weeks of where she had to read this book on how does a seed grow. And then she had to answer various questions about it or draw things or whatever it is. And she found it very annoying and tiresome. But, as you read that simple book and you read the simple story of, how does a seed grow, it's very, very analogous to what we do in regional economics and regional economic development, right? In that, ultimately, we're trying to plant some seeds in the ground. Those are businesses or industries, and we want to nurture them and so that they grow and thrive into, a healthy garden, a healthy farm, a healthy ecosystem. But there's a big key difference between what a farmer does and what we'll call, say, Farmer Grant does. In that Farmer Grant, he can prepare the soil and he can encourage seeds to grow and he can help things grow once they've germinated. But the big difference is that Farmer Grant doesn't actually get to go to the store, buy a seed or a seedling and plant it in the ground. You don't get to cultivate a particular tech industry or a tech cluster. We have ample research that suggests lots of places that have tried, but we simply cannot predict or create particular tech industry clusters, right? We can't do it on purpose, right? So that basically means that there's enormous amounts of randomness, because essentially what we're trying to do is trying to create the conditions under which maybe, hopefully, a seed falls through the wind and lands on our plot, and then we get to tend it and help it grow. So, what does that mean if that's what we have to do if we're going to try and cultivate a bioscience sector, a biotech sector in Montana? We got to ask ourselves our question, well, is our environment good? Right? What do we have to do to ensure that we have the soil, the space, the water, and the sun so that if a seed lands, that it's likely to grow into something that will bear fruit? And, the other question, of course, we have to ask is, okay, we can put in the work to make it so that if a seed lands, that it will grow, but how likely is it that we're actually going to get seeds? And what can we do to maybe fan seeds or, try and, vacuum suck seeds into our plot? So those are our big questions for the day. And so let's start with just what do we have in terms of our existing bioscience sector? And obviously, before we can measure something, we have to be able to define it. And defining bioscience is actually pretty tricky. While we kind of have some intuitive understanding that it has something to do with kind of biology and science or life science, in terms of actually matching that intuitive concept into industries or occupations that we can actually measure, it gets really tricky, particularly once you move below the national level in terms of, the level of classification that we have data available. But broadly speaking, the traditional definition of bioscience includes industries in agricultural biotechnology, medical and testing labs, medical devices and equipment, medical product distribution, pharmaceuticals, and then various forms of research and development. And if you take our best ability to try and measure that sector, in Montana and across the country, that this kind of traditional notion of bioscience employs approximately 3,000 people in Montana, which is less than 1% of total private employment. And that's, relative to a national bioscience employment, which is about 2% of employment. So you do the ratio of, how much of it is in Montana versus how much of it is in the US. We call that a location quotient. And if that's a measure of concentration. That's what the map here shows. And, Montana basically has the lowest concentration of bioscience as traditionally measured amongst all states in the country, although we kind of compete with North Dakota depending on the year and the amount of measurement error and what we're measuring. However, it's worth noting that Montana has a lot of life scientists, right? So if we move from an industry-based classification to an occupation-based classification, Montana actually has a very high location quotient, 2.2, in terms of how many life scientists we have, right? So we're the fourth highest state in terms of our concentration of life scientists. So how do we have this disparity? How do we have a significant concentration of life scientists, but not a significant concentration of traditional bioscience industries? And basically about half of Montana's life scientists work in some form of government entity, and many of the rest of them work in non-traditional bioscience industries like forestry, environmental consulting, environmental conservation and wildlife organizations, and those kind of exist outside the traditional bioscience definition. But given that that's a made-up definition, we can kind of define this however we want. So, it's ultimately worth trying to be clear that bioscience isn't actually a super coherent thing, right? So if we look at these kind of core components of the traditional bioscience industry, we actually don't see them co-located with each other, right? So, where you find the agricultural biotech is not positively or even significantly correlated with where you find medical devices or equipment, or where pharmaceuticals are is not actually that strongly correlated. Where pharmaceutical manufacturing isn't that correlated with pharmaceutical R&D, right? And so, they're not correlated with each other, and they also have completely different correlations with kind of you might consider underlying conditions, right? So some things like, manufacturing or biotech, they tend to be concentrated more with other manufacturing sectors, whereas R&D and pharmaceuticals or developing medical devices and equipment, they tend to be concentrated more with knowledge industries. And so it's not clear that you can say, well, I want to attract bioscience, and you can go and do a set of things that will attract all the different aspects of bioscience, right? In some sense, you really have to kind of identify, well, what bioscience are we actually interested in Montana? And more importantly, what do we think is more likely to succeed given our conditions, right? And ultimately, there's a whole bunch of different components that we can think about, right? So there's pure science, there's the movement to applied science. And in particular, we can then move application into, are we developing goods like drugs or medical devices? Or are we developing services, where we're going to try and help do consulting or various applications to improve, the delivery of healthcare or public health, or improve the environment in ways that ultimately affect, quality of life or quantity of life. And then if we're going to do goods, are we just doing the development, essentially the knowledge work? Or are we also going to try and move into the manufacture and the distribution and the marketing of the goods and devices that we produce? And on a services side, are we, are we just trying to come up with the ideas, or are we trying to help implement those ideas through some form of traded sector, services sector? And then kind of underlying all of it, how much are we actually going to put into trying to train the people that will do the work both here, but also to the extent that we have universities that attract people from other states, are we trying to train people that we can help send back into other places? So these are all different parts of bioscience, broadly defined, that we could imagine trying to grow or cultivate here in Montana. But what you do to try and encourage a manufacturing plant is certainly different than what you would do to try if you're going to do more in terms of the development of a public health consulting firm. So there's a very broad set of industries or a set of ideas or concepts. And, ultimately, as you try and move forward, you kind of need to start to understand, well, what are we ultimately trying to do? So there's several kind of key aspects that we have to, bring to bear as we think about trying to cultivate our bioscience garden. The first key point is we don't actually get to pick the winners and losers. Right. Montana, Grant, any entity in Montana has no ability to ultimately go out and say, I want to grow this. Right. We get to tend our garden when we have limited control over what seeds land and how well they grow. But ultimately, there's a lot of this that is just random. Right. There's a random component to where industries end up locating, where they end up succeeding and growing and ultimately forming some form of cluster. The second key point is ultimately the thing that Montana has, the strongest thing in our, existing ecosystem, is our ability to attract as well as to create talent, right? So talent has two words in my little farmer metaphor. Talent is both the seed, right? In bioscience, a lot of the historical evidence on the development of bioscience clusters ties it to particular star scientists. A star scientist decides, I want to live in this place. They take their ideas, and ultimately their ideas are successful. They spin them out. They grow into companies. And so, talent becomes both seeds. But if I have a great idea, I also need other stuff. I need other talented people to help me execute on my vision. And so you need talent, to the extent that you can attract talent, that we can attract talent to Montana. That means it increases the amount of seeds that we might get. And it also increases our ability to successfully germinate and grow that seed, right? So, okay, that's what talent is. So, what is it that attracts talent to Montana, right? So the key thing that obviously Montana is known for is it offers a good quality of life, and a lot of times when it comes to starting companies, access to family is important, right? Why is Seattle a tech hub? It's because Bill Gates decided he wanted to go home. Oddly enough, why is Silicon Valley is in part because one of the founders of one of the key semiconductor companies that kind of helped spin out a lot of what became Silicon Valley had an ailing mother who lived in San Francisco, so he moved home to be closer to her. Right? So there's a lot of randomness, but quality of life, attraction to family, attraction to natural amenities, attraction to consumer amenities is a big part of what convinces people that they say, hey, I want to live there. Now, ultimately, you also need to offer other things other than quality of life. Ultimately, it's quality of life relative to cost. And Montana, at least relative to large metro areas, has historically offered low cost, although that gap has been shrinking. But the weakness for Montana has been, it offers more limited job opportunities, particularly if you have a spouse or you have kids that you're trying to raise and you're trying to say, well, is this going to be ultimately a place where I can grow and thrive with a whole family? So, that's the thing that we'll usually have to mitigate. But it's not just about attracting talent. It's also about creating talent, right? And that means investing in education amongst people who are here and are likely to want to live here. And it also means not just education, it also means encouraging entrepreneurialism and experimentation, right? So, a talented person may have great ideas, but if they don't try and actually experiment, go out and put a seed in the ground, so to speak, then you don't get the benefit of that talent. And so if you make it easy, particularly in a small place like Montana, to experiment, to try new stuff, you're increasing the amount of seeds that are likely to show up in your plot. The third key point, and this is kind of the negative point for Montana, is that we have big weaknesses with respect to that. We're a small state with relatively small communities that is isolated from other tech hubs. Right. So this means in the jargon of regional economics that we have limited agglomerative economies. Right. So this little scatter plot here shows the size of a city relative to its traditional bioscience concentration. And you can see that there's a clear positive relationship. It's not to say that small communities like Missoula can't have large concentrations. They can. But on average, it's certainly easier in larger cities. And so it's worth trying to understand, well, what is this agglomeration? And why is it, the size and density factor? And why do they matter? And ultimately, the thing that regional economists have learned about clustering is that there's key things that happen when you put a bunch of industry, firms in the same industry together, or also just a bunch of firms, together more largely. First, you have more knowledge spillovers, right? So that means more new ideas are being generated, and the people who are working in industries are learning more quickly, right? So that means both more seeds and better opportunities to grow those seeds. The second thing is that when you put a bunch of firms together, they benefit because they get to start poaching workers from other firms that are doing the same thing, and they can, build networks and have all that kind of ease of access to talent. But workers also like to locate in deep pools because it means that they have insurance. If my company goes out of business, I can easily transfer to another company I don't have to move houses. I can just change jobs. It means that I can switch jobs easier, more quickly, and get myself to the best match. And ultimately, because I'm in such a dense industry, and I'm surrounded by people who work in the same industry, when I may be meeting them at the bars or the restaurants or at dinner parties, I learn more quickly as well. There's also benefits in terms of other inputs, not just labor, but maybe access to particular specialized capital or specialized banking or legal services that can help firms succeed. There's also benefit from, to the extent that there's one set of customers, and if you can be closer to them, there's advantages from being able to learn to that. And ultimately, there's this underlying business of natural advantage, which historically used to be ports. But now in kind of modern tech economies, universities are kind of the natural advantage that gives areas a leg up because they're kind of like a port for knowledge industries like biotech or other tech companies. It's also worth understanding that COVID has actually created a few opportunities that, maybe might generate a greater amount of seeds blowing in the wind that we might want to try and help cultivate and allow it to grow into something more robust, right? So we've learned we need more capacity to fight pandemics because we know pandemics will occur. And that means both healthcare capacity, traditional hospitals and all that stuff, but also just the equipment and testing and PPE and all that kind of stuff. But we also need a lot more public health capacity. right? And so while there's harder to get money into public health, I'm hopeful that COVID will, help us realize that the investments in public health do pay off, and not just to fight pandemics. A paper came out a couple weeks ago which found that 44% of the life expectancy gains since 1990 are attributable to public health. Right, that's more than all of the investments in pharmaceuticals that have come out over that 25-year period. It's more than any other improvement in medical care. Right, so public health pays off. And we need to invest more in it and do a better job of it. And so that will create opportunities, potentially in Montana to kind of grow more in biotech, but that's, in the side of public health, not just in the more traditional goods of pharmaceuticals or medical devices. The other thing that COVID might be doing is weakening agglomeration, right? Is remote work, or, if these forces of technology allow us to spread out more, then that means that these forces that kind of glom bioscience into these very small, there's basically 20% of metros have concentrations of bioscience. If that weakens, that also creates more opportunities for us to grow and cultivate bioscience here in Montana. But, the key thing that we have to remember is, and comes from a recent paper on tech clusters, which is that though history provides multiple examples of the development of new tech clusters, predicting or purposely creating the location of the next cluster might be impossible, right? And so there's a lot, that's what I mean. There's a lot of randomness. We can do what we can to cultivate our garden and help nurture things once they grow, but whether or not some seeds are going to show up, that's outside of our control. And with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Grant.
Thank you, Bryce. So what does that mean? And if this is the case, then why do we have this effort underway to create a bioscience cluster? Well, what the next couple of days, I think, are going to show us is that, one, we're not starting from scratch. We are not out there starting a new farm. We've actually got an incredible legacy of bioscience industry in our state. Industry and leaders who, I would argue, punch well above their weight. So what we lack in numbers, I think we more than make up for in quality. And I think what we'll find is that we actually have collectively as a community and as people aspiring to shape the future of our economy, have inherited a pretty rich garden with a lot of opportunity. And I think we collectively have an opportunity to think really carefully about the conditions under which we continue to cultivate that garden, if you will, to carry on Bryce's analogy. So we are very hopeful and optimistic that what we're going to hear from the governor and from Rocky Mountain Lab Director Marshall Bloom in just a few minutes is a little bit about how some of those exceptional leaders in industry and in research institutions were here at the ready when our governor needed them most in order to really navigate what is the unprecedented health crisis across the world right now. And we've done quite well in Montana so far, and I think we'll hear a little bit about how our industries helped shape that, which will give us a nice platform to start talking about how we can in turn ripen the conditions for continued success into the future. Bryce, I'm really grateful for your leading us off. I think we'll make the case over the next 3 days that we have ripe conditions to continue to move forward, and that maybe the luck was had generations ago, and now it's our job to make sure that we continue to make the most of that good luck. The next session is our fireside chat with Governor Steve Bullock and Rocky Mountain Lab Director Marshall Bloom. Thank you.